My sister bragged at Christmas dinner not everyone can handle a real career in tech. She said it loudly, smiling as a few relatives laughed along. I stayed quiet and kept eating. Then my grandpa slowly set down his fork, looked at me and asked, "Is that not the startup you invested in last year?" What happened next shocked everyone. I am Nia, 32 years old, and my family always thought I was a massive failure because I dropped out of my business program to work on internet side hustles. They had absolutely no idea that I was the anonymous founder of the venture capital firm that had just bought my sister out of her own company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to sit in silence while arrogant family members underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent Atlanta suburb meant that keeping up appearances was a full-time job for my parents. My mother Brenda and my father Marcus worshipped at the altar of corporate titles, luxury cars, and country club memberships. To the outside world, we were the picture of black excellence. But behind the heavy oak doors of our sprawling brick home, affection was strictly transactional. The dining room was always the main stage for our family politics, the place where you were either praised as a hero or put on trial as a disappointment. This Christmas dinner was the grand finale of the year, and the tension was palpable from the moment I walked through the front door. The massive mahogany table was set with my mother and her finest china, the crystal glasses reflecting the warm amber light from the chandelier above. The air was thick with the rich, comforting smells of a traditional holiday feast. There was baked macaroni and cheese with a perfectly crisped golden crust collard greens that had been simmering with smoked turkey since dawn, candied yams dripping with brown sugar, and a massive honey-baked ham sitting proudly in the center. It looked exactly like a picture-perfect holiday magazine cover, but the energy in the room was entirely toxic. The clinking of heavy silver forks against porcelain plates sounded more like swords clashing than a peaceful family gathering. I sat quietly at the far corner of the table, gently swirling a glass of red wine, completely ignored by everyone. I was used to this designated spot at the edge of the family circle. Across from me sat the undeniable guests of honor, my younger sister Jasmine and her husband Brad. Jasmine had always been the golden child, the one who followed my parents' strict playbook for success, without ever questioning it. She got the right corporate job, climbed the management ladder, and married Brad. Brad was a 33-year-old white tech executive who constantly tried way too hard to fit in with our family, and my parents absolutely adored him for his executive status and his high salary. My mother hovered over Brad like he was a visiting dignitary. I watched in silent amusement as she completely bypassed my empty plate, carrying the massive serving platter of ham straight over to his side of the table. She carefully selected the thickest, most succulent center cut of the meat, placing it gently onto his plate, before scooping an extra large serving of macaroni and cheese right next to it. She patted his shoulder affectionately, beaming with pride, and asking if the temperature in the room was comfortable enough for him. Brad leaned back in his chair, wearing a fleece corporate vest over his button-down shirt, and flashed a cheesy smile. He swallowed a heavy bite and pointed his fork at my mother, loudly declaring that the food was absolutely boossin'. Hearing him use that slang so awkwardly made me want to cringe out of my own skin. But my father Marcus just laughed heartily, pouring Brad another glass of expensive bourbon. They praised Brad for closing another quarter with record sales at his tech company, treating him like a conquering hero. I just took a slow sip of my wine and observed the circus. 5 years ago, I had walked away from a prestigious Ivy League business program. I realized the traditional corporate path was suffocating, and I wanted to build my own consulting firm to invest in raw, overlooked talent. To my parents, leaving that program was an unforgivable betrayal. They labeled me a drifter, a massive disappointment, who was just playing around on the internet, while Jasmine built a real, respectable career. They never bothered to ask what my freelance consulting actually entailed. They never looked past my simple, unbranded cashmere sweaters to see the empire I was quietly building. and I certainly never bothered to correct them when my firm quietly grew into a massive venture capital powerhouse. I learned early on that moving in silence was my greatest protection against their constant judgment. The room was warm, filled with the crackle of the fireplace and the loud, booming laughter of my father. My Grandpa Langston sat beside me eating his meal slowly, his sharp eyes taking in every single dynamic at the table. He was a retired postal worker, a man of few words, and the only person in this house who ever saw me for who I truly was. He knew the truth about my business, but he kept my secret waiting for the perfect moment. As the dinner progressed, the conversation naturally shifted back to Jasmine and Brad, as it always did. Jasmine tapped her perfectly manicured nails against her crystal water glass. She adjusted her silk blouse and deliberately rested her left arm on the table, making sure the light caught the face of the brand-new diamond-encrusted Rolex wrapped around her wrist. My mother gasped right on cue, reaching across the table to admire the watch, loudly declaring that her brilliant daughter deserved nothing but the absolute best. Jasmine smiled a practiced, modest smile, soaking in the admiration from our parents. But her eyes were entirely cold when they shifted away from my mother and locked directly onto me. The casual chatter died down, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. I knew exactly what was coming next. This was her favorite part of the evening, the part where she elevated herself by tearing me down. I maintained my neutral expression, resting my hands in my lap, ready for the performance to begin. Jasmine cleared her throat, a delicate little sound designed to command the absolute attention of every single person in the room. She began her monologue by loudly announcing her official title for what felt like the fifth time that evening: Chief Operating Officer of NovaStream. She dragged out the syllables like they were dipped in solid gold, ensuring the weight of her new position settled heavily over the dining table. She told my parents about her grueling hours, the endless high-stakes strategy meetings with the executive board, and the sheer crushing pressure of managing a tech startup that had just closed a massive Series A funding round. She threw around corporate buzzwords with reckless abandon, talking about scalability, synergistic alignment, and disruptive innovation. My parents nodded along with wide, admiring eyes. They were completely mesmerized by her sophisticated corporate jargon, even though I knew for an absolute fact that neither my mother nor my father had any idea what those words actually meant in a business context. They just knew it sounded expensive, and in our family, expensive was always synonymous with successful. Then came the grand reveal of the watch. Jasmine deliberately held up her wrist again, twisting it slowly so the chandelier light could catch every single facet of the diamond bezel on her new Rolex. She said Brad had bought it for her as a promotion gift because she had practically carried the entire company on her back this past quarter. Brad puffed out his chest, leaning over to kiss her cheek. He loudly declared to the table that his wife was the smartest and most ruthless woman in the entire tech industry, and that NovaStream would be completely lost without her operational genius. My mother actually clapped her hands together, genuine tears of pride welling up in her eyes as she looked at her perfect daughter. But Jasmine was not finished. Her own success was never quite enough for her unless she could use it as a weapon. She needed a contrast to make her accomplishments shine even brighter, and I had always been her favorite dark background. She turned her perfectly contoured face toward me, her smile dripping with heavy condescension. The casual, celebratory energy in the room shifted instantly into something sharp and predatory. She said, "You know, Nia, I really wish you could experience what it feels like to be part of something real and impactful." The energy in a high-level corporate boardroom is just intoxicating. It takes serious dedication, a massive amount of grit, and a very high level of intellect to survive in the tech world. It is definitely not an environment that everyone can handle. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her sparkling water, letting the insult hang heavily in the warm air before she reached out to twist the knife. She tilted her head, putting on a mask of fake sibling concern. She said, "I mean, playing around with those little freelance projects on your laptop all day from your living room must be very relaxing. But do you not ever want to build an actual career? Do you not get tired of just drifting through life with no real direction and no real income?" The table grew dead silent. Even the quiet clinking of silverware against porcelain stopped completely. My father stopped chewing his food and looked over at me, waiting to see if I would finally break. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice taking on that sickly sweet tone that made my stomach turn. She said, "I still do not understand why you threw your entire life away. You had a guaranteed spot in the MBA program at Wharton. You were right there, Nia. You could have actually been somebody important. You could have made mom and dad proud. But you just quit. You completely dropped out to do what exactly? Write silly blog posts. Do internet consulting for nobodies who cannot afford real agencies. It is honestly just sad to watch you waste your potential year after year. You are 32 years old, Nia. You are living in a complete fantasy world, while the rest of us are out here building real wealth and securing our family legacy." The mention of my MBA dropout status was an old familiar weapon in our family dynamic. 5 years ago, when I walked away from Wharton, it had caused a screaming match that fractured my relationship with my parents permanently. They could not understand that I was leaving a rigid, outdated academic system because I had already found a highly lucrative gap in the venture capital market. I did not need a business degree to teach me how to identify undervalued tech startups. I just needed capital and anonymity. But my family had instantly labeled me a massive failure, a quitter who could not handle the intense pressure of an elite academic environment. My father finally cleared his throat, nodding slowly in agreement with Jasmine. He looked at me with that familiar, heavy expression of deep disappointment that I had grown up with. He said, "Your sister is exactly right, Nia. We did not raise you to be a quitter. We gave you every single opportunity to succeed in life. We paid for your undergraduate degree. And you threw it all back in our faces to chase some ridiculous pipe dream on the internet. You are a smart woman, but you have absolutely zero discipline and zero ambition." My mother chimed in immediately, her voice sharp and scolding. She pointed her silver fork at me across the table. She said, "Look at your sister Nia. Look at what she has built with her life. She has a high-paying executive title, a wonderful husband, and real respect in her industry. You should be taking notes instead of sitting there looking so indifferent. It is embarrassing that we even have to explain the simple concept of hard work to you at your age." I listened to their coordinated attack without breaking eye contact with Jasmine. Inside my mind, the irony of her arrogant words was almost too sweet to bear. She was bragging about her operational genius at NovaStream, using fancy words like scalability and disruptive innovation. But I was the one who had spent the last 3 weeks poring over the confidential financial records of NovaStream. I was the one who knew that their so-called record-breaking sales quarter was built on a massive illegal house of cards. Jasmine thought she was the absolute apex predator in the room, proudly wearing a diamond Rolex that I knew for a fact was paid for with embezzled company funds. I maintained my calm, neutral expression. I did not raise my voice, and I did not try to defend my internet side hustles. I just let them talk, letting them dig their own shallow graves with every arrogant word they spoke. I rested my hands quietly in my lap, knowing that the trap had already been set, and they were all dancing blindly right into the center of it. The silence at the table was finally broken by Brad. If my eyes were a camera lens, they would have slowly pushed in on him at that exact moment, capturing every single detail of his unwarranted arrogance. He adjusted his fleece corporate vest, leaned his forearms heavily onto the polished mahogany table, and interlaced his fingers. He looked at me with an expression that he probably thought was deeply empathetic, but it just looked incredibly smug and patronizing. He cleared his throat loudly, making sure he had the absolute undivided attention of the entire room before he began his performance. He said, "Yo, Nia, real talk. I know it has been tough for you out there grinding on your own, trying to make these little internet gigs work. The hustle is real, I completely get it. But sometimes you have to know when to pivot. You have to know when to fold the losing hand and join a winning team." He bobbed his head a little to the side, throwing in a hand gesture that looked so completely unnatural and awkward, coming from a white guy who grew up playing lacrosse at a private school in Connecticut. He was trying so hard to sound down, adopting this forced cadence that made my skin crawl. He took a long sip of his expensive bourbon, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass, and continued his monologue. He was completely oblivious to how ridiculous he sounded. He said, "Let me break it down for you, Naya, because the tech game is a whole different beast. It is not like setting up a basic website from your couch and calling yourself a consultant. We are talking about high-level venture capital and hyper-growth scaling. NovaStream just closed our Series A funding round." He paused dramatically, raising his eyebrows at me. He said, "Do you even know what a Series A is, Nia?" He did not wait for me to answer. He just chuckled lightly and shook his head, looking over at my father, as if to share an inside joke about my total ignorance regarding the business world. My father smiled back, nodding encouragingly at Brad to continue educating me. Brad turned his attention back to me, adopting the tone of a patient kindergarten teacher, explaining basic math to a slow child. He said a Series A means the big dogs have finally come to the table. It means serious institutional investors have looked at our monthly recurring revenue, our user acquisition cost, and our scalable infrastructure, and they have decided that we are a unicorn in the making. We just secured a massive cash injection from a major venture capital firm. These guys do not just hand out millions of dollars to anyone with a business plan. They do aggressive due diligence. They send in teams of lawyers and accountants. They audit absolutely everything from the code base to the bank statements. They only back absolute winners who have a proven track record of market dominance. He leaned back and smiled broadly. He said, "You have to understand, the venture capital world is ruthless. The partners at these funds, they are absolute sharks. They see right through the fluff. They look at a guy like me leading a sales team to record breaking numbers, and they recognize a killer instinct. They recognize that Jasmine and I are the absolute engine driving this entire machine." When the lead partner of that fund signed that term sheet, they were basically betting on my personal ability to close high-level enterprise deals. It takes a certain type of aggressive alpha mindset to survive in that arena, Nia. A mindset that you clearly lacked when you dropped out of Wharton. Hearing him brag about due diligence and term sheets to the exact woman who had personally signed those documents and ordered the extensive forensic audit on his company almost made me burst out laughing. The same audit that uncovered his fake revenue streams and the shell companies he used to artificially inflate those sales numbers. But I did not interrupt him. I just let him keep talking. Brad leaned in even closer across the table, his face turning a slight shade of red from the bourbon, and the pure excitement of hearing his own voice echo through the dining room. He said, "Because we are flush with cash now, we are aggressively expanding our operations across the board. We are scaling up our customer success department to handle the massive influx of new enterprise clients. Now, normally, we only hire candidates with a solid corporate background for these roles. We want people who know how to navigate a fast-paced tech ecosystem and use advanced relationship management software. But you are family, and family always looks out for family, right?" He smiled, showing all of his teeth. He said, "So, I am willing to throw you a bone here. I talked to the hiring manager yesterday, and I can get you an interview for a Tier 1 customer support associate position." He paused again, letting the magnitude of his supposed generosity sink in. He said, "It is an entry-level role, obviously. You will be answering basic support tickets, resetting passwords for locked-out users, dealing with angry clients on the phone, stuff like that. In this role, you will not have to worry about high-level strategy or critical thinking. You just read the manual and follow the prompt. You will be tied to a headset, and you will be working the weekend shift to start. The pay is strictly hourly, and you will have to track every single minute of your time on a monitoring software. But it gets your foot in the door. It gets you out of the house and into a real office environment. It is a chance for you to see how a real profitable tech business actually operates from the ground up. You will learn how to follow a corporate script, how to escalate issues to actual management, and how to be part of a team that is building something bigger than themselves." He reached across the table and tapped his index finger sharply near my dinner plate, invading my personal space to make sure I understood the gravity of his offer. He said, "Think about it, Nia. You could finally have a steady paycheck. You could get basic dental insurance and a small matching contribution to a retirement fund. You would not have to worry about where your next freelance client is coming from or if your little internet business is going to completely bankrupt you before you turn 35. You would be a small part of the NovaStream family. And who knows, if you put your head down, show some real grit, swallow your pride, and follow the standard operating procedures without causing any trouble, maybe in a few years you could move up to become a shift team lead. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, looking immensely satisfied with himself. He said, "It is a golden ticket, Nia. Most people would absolutely kill for this kind of access to a hyper-growth startup. I am sticking my neck out for you here. I am putting my own professional reputation on the line by recommending someone with your spotty employment history. All you have to do is say the word, drop the stubborn independent act, and I will make it happen. You just have to be willing to do the hard work and start from the absolute bottom where you belong." He took another sip of his bourbon, staring at me as if waiting for me to fall to my knees and thank him for saving my pathetic life. The heavy silence that followed Brad and his condescending job offer was quickly filled by my father. Marcus set his heavy silver fork down onto his fine porcelain plate and leaned across the massive dining table, his face deadly serious. He looked at me with an expectation so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. He said, "Well, Nia, are you going to say thank you? Your brother-in-law just handed you an incredible opportunity on a silver platter. He is offering to personally vouch for you at a highly successful tech company. You need to recognize how rare that is for someone in your exact position." My mother chimed in immediately, her voice sharp and urgent. She said, "Exactly. Do you know how many people would kill for a chance to work at NovaStream right now? Brad is putting his own flawless professional reputation on the line just to help you out of this pathetic rut you have dug for yourself. The absolute least you can do is show some basic gratitude. Look at him, Nia. Say thank you to Brad. Thank you." My father picked up his crystal glass of bourbon, swirling the amber liquid as he stared me down. He pointed his finger at me like a judge handing down a harsh sentence. He said, "You have spent the last 5 years floating around the internet claiming to be an independent consultant. But we all know that is just a polite way of saying you are unemployed and living in complete denial. You have absolutely no corporate benefits. You have no matched retirement plan. You have no real security. You are living paycheck to paycheck, assuming you even get a paycheck from these imaginary internet clients of yours. Brad is offering you a solid lifeline. He is offering you a real job with a real W-2 form. It is time for you to swallow your massive pride. You walked away from Wharton because you thought you were simply too smart for the system. You thought you could bypass the hard work and just magically become a boss. Well, look exactly where that arrogance got you. You are sitting at this table 32 years old with absolutely nothing to show for your life, while your younger sister and her husband are out there building a literal tech empire. You need to accept this customer service job and be thrilled about it. You need to work your way up from the bottom. It will teach you the humility you so desperately lack. It will teach you how to respect corporate authority instead of running away from it. My father continued, his voice rising in volume, turning our family dining room into his own personal lecture hall. He talked extensively about his own struggles in the corporate world, how he had to grind his way up the ladder in the banking industry through sheer grit and determination. He proudly stated how he never took a handout from anyone, but noted how I clearly and desperately needed one today. He said that the true meaning of family was about lifting each other up in times of failure, and Brad was doing the heavy lifting for me tonight. He expected me to be completely submissive. He expected me to look at Brad like a savior. The psychological pressure in the room was suffocating. It was a highly coordinated, well-rehearsed effort to break my spirit and force me into the tiny, pathetic mold they had designed for me. They wanted me to be the family failure so they could feel better about their own life choices. Before the heavy silence could even settle, after my father finished his aggressive tirade, my mother smoothly took the reins. Brenda had never been satisfied with merely attacking my career choices. She fundamentally needed to dismantle my entire existence as a woman. She delicately smoothed the linen napkin on her lap, her eyes scanning me from head to toe with pure, unfiltered disdain. She said it is not just about your lack of a real job, Marcus. It is about her entire lifestyle. Look at her sitting there. She lives in that tiny, nondescript apartment downtown. She never brings any friends or boyfriends around for the holidays. She keeps everything so ridiculously private that it borders on clinical paranoia. We never know what you are actually doing with your days, Nia. You completely shut your own family out of your life. My mother sighed heavily, executing a dramatic display of maternal suffering that she had perfected over decades of practice. She said, "You are 32 years old, Nia. You should be married by now. You should be building a beautiful home and hosting elegant holiday dinners exactly like this one. Instead, you isolate yourself like a hermit. You refuse to network with the right caliber of people. You stubbornly refuse to attend the country club events and the charity galas we invite you to. You just hide in your apartment behind your computer screen day and night. It is completely unnatural. A woman of your age and your background should not be living such a secretive, closed-off life. Do you have any idea how much it makes people talk? My friends at the tennis club are always asking about you, asking what my oldest daughter is up to these days, and I never know what to say to them. It is incredibly embarrassing for me to have to smile and pretend you are doing well, when the reality is my oldest daughter is just playing on the internet completely alone." She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a sharp, conspiratorial whisper that was intentionally meant to be heard by every single person at the table. She said, "And honestly, maybe if you put a little more effort into your physical appearance, you could actually attract a man of real substance. You used to be such a pretty girl, Nia. You had so much potential. But now you wear these plain unbranded cashmere sweaters. You do not wear any noticeable makeup. You do not even try to present yourself as a successful, high-value woman in society. Men who are at the very top of their fields, elite men like Brad, they want a woman who can stand confidently beside them and elevate their social status. They do not want to marry a project. They do not want to support a woman who cannot even support herself." She gestured grandly toward Jasmine, who was sitting up perfectly straight, practically glowing under the warmth of our mother and her absolute adoration. Brenda said, "Just look at your sister." Jasmine perfectly understands how the real world works. She understands that a successful, meaningful life is built on strategic partnerships and mutual ambition. She found a brilliant, highly driven man in the tech industry, and together they are building an absolute power couple dynamic. They attend the right events, they know the right investors, they are looking at buying luxury real estate, and they know exactly how to present themselves to high society. They are actively building a legacy that this family can be proud of. That is what a real functioning marriage looks like, Nia. That is what happens when you have actual focus and drive instead of just empty rebellion. Jasmine reached out and placed her perfectly manicured hand over Brad, and his hand smiling sweetly up at him before turning her gaze back to me. Her eyes were completely devoid of empathy, filled instead with a toxic fake pity that made my skin crawl. She said, "Mom is entirely right, Nia. We are only saying these things because we love you and we want what is best for you. Brad and I have such an incredible, fulfilling life together. We travel to Europe twice a year, we eat at Michelin star restaurants, and we never have to spend a single second worrying about our financial future. I just want you to experience a tiny fraction of the happiness and security that we have. But you absolutely cannot do that if you keep isolating yourself and pretending that your little freelance gigs are a real career path. You have to let your guard down and let us help you. You have to let Brad give you this customer service job. It is quite literally the only way you are ever going to get your life back on track before it is too late." The coordinated attack was relentless. It was a classic family tactic they had utilized since I was a teenager. Whenever I stepped outside their rigid lines of expectation, they would circle the wagons and bombard me with shame until I submitted. But I was not a teenager anymore. I sat quietly, letting the rich scent of the honey-baked ham and the sweet candied yams mix with the bitter, toxic words floating across the dining table. I looked at my mother, noting the expensive pearls resting against her collarbone, a gift my father bought to apologize for a massive screaming match they had last Christmas. I looked at my father, whose banking career had actually stalled a decade ago, leaving him obsessed with living vicariously through Jasmine and Brad. They were projecting all of their own deep-seated insecurities directly onto me. Because I lived privately, they assumed I lived poorly. Because I did not brag about my income, they assumed I had none. Because I did not parade a man around at their country club dinners, they assumed I was unwanted and unlovable. The irony was so thick, you could cut it with a steak knife. They were lecturing me about financial security while praising Brad, a man whose entire corporate existence I now legally owned. They were lecturing me about a successful marriage while praising a couple whose entire lavish lifestyle was funded by corporate theft and fraudulent accounting. Brad puffed out his chest, clearly energized by my parents and their glowing endorsements. He took another large gulp of his bourbon and pointed his glass directly at me. He said, "You hear that, Nia? That is the sound of people who actually care about you dropping some hard truths. I am not going to offer this customer service job twice. You either want to step up and be a productive member of society, or you want to keep playing victim on the internet. It is your call. But do not come crying to Jasmine and me when your little consulting business completely dries up and you cannot make your rent next month." The psychological pressure mounted in the room thick and suffocating. They were waiting for my reaction. They wanted me to yell. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to storm out of the dining room so they could spend the rest of the evening talking about how emotionally unstable and ungrateful I was. It was their absolute favorite holiday game, but I refused to play. I remained perfectly still, my expression completely blank, holding the gaze of my father, then my mother, then Jasmine, and finally Brad. I let their cruel words hang in the warm air, gathering weight, cementing their incredible arrogance. I was carefully loading the weapon they had just handed me, waiting for the exact right moment to pull the trigger. The air in the dining room was so thick with their shared arrogance that it felt like breathing underwater. My father had just finished his lecture. My mother was practically vibrating with self-righteous satisfaction, and Brad was sitting there with a smug grin, fully expecting me to surrender. I opened my mouth, ready to calmly dismantle their entire reality. But I never even got the chance to speak the first syllable. A sudden, sharp, and incredibly loud sound cut through the suffocating tension. It was the harsh clatter of heavy silver striking fine porcelain. My Grandpa Langston had slammed his fork down onto his plate. He did not just drop it. He brought it down with the kind of deliberate, focused force that demanded absolute and immediate attention. The sound echoed off the high ceilings of the dining room, slicing through the toxic chatter and silencing the entire table instantly. For a man who had barely spoken 3 sentences all evening, the physical dominance of that single gesture was staggering. Everyone froze. My mother stopped mid-breath, her hand hovering over her crystal wine glass. My father blinked rapidly, completely taken aback. Brad lost his condescending smile, his brow furrowing in confusion. Grandpa Langston did not rush. He possessed the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who had seen decades of real struggle and recognized cheap arrogance when he saw it. He slowly reached for his linen napkin, lifted it, and carefully dabbed the corners of his mouth. He folded the napkin and placed it neatly beside his plate. The crackling of the faux fireplace in the living room was suddenly the only sound in the entire house. He looked up, his sharp, observant eyes scanning the faces of my parents, then settling coldly on Brad and Jasmine. For a long, agonizing moment, he just looked at them. He looked at Brad in his expensive fleece vest, and he looked at Jasmine in her diamond-encrusted Rolex. His gaze was heavy with an intense, unspoken judgment that made Brad shift uncomfortably in his seat. Then Grandpa Langston turned his head slowly to his right, locking his eyes directly onto mine. His expression softened just a fraction, a tiny glint of amusement dancing in his dark eyes. He took a deep, steadying breath, ensuring that his voice would carry perfectly to every single corner of that massive dining room. He said, "Nia, Nova Stream, is that not the startup your fund just poured $15 million into last month?" He did not ask it like a question, he dropped it like a bomb. The words hung in the warm air, heavy and lethal, completely obliterating the reality my family had spent the last 2 hours carefully constructing. $15 million. Your fund. The sheer magnitude of those phrases collided violently with the pathetic image they had painted of me just moments before. If my eyes were a camera lens, I would have captured the exact beautiful second that the cognitive dissonance fractured their minds. It was a masterpiece of human reaction. The deadly silence that filled the dining room was no longer the oppressive silence of my isolation. It was the deafening silence of their absolute shock. I watched Brad first. The smug, patronizing tech executive persona literally melted off his face. His pale complexion drained of all color, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His brain, conditioned to analyze venture capital metrics and funding rounds, was violently short-circuiting as it tried to process the information. He knew exactly what had happened last month. NovaStream had indeed received a massive $15 million cash injection from a stealth venture capital firm called Onyx Capital Partners. It was the exact funding round he had been bragging about all evening. The realization that the sister-in-law he had just offered a minimum wage customer service job to was the architect of that deal was physically breaking him. His jaw went slack, and his eyes darted wildly between Grandpa Langston and me, searching for any sign that this was a cruel, elaborate joke. Jasmine looked even worse. My golden child sister, the supposed chief operating officer of the year, sat completely frozen. Her perfectly manicured hand, the one heavy with the Rolex she loved so much, trembled slightly where it rested against the white tablecloth. The confident, predatory gleam in her eyes had been instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny it, to laugh it off, but no sound came out. She just stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly as the implications of our grandfather and his words crashed down on her. If I owned the fund that capitalized her company, I effectively owned her. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted completely. My parents were entirely lost in the shockwave. My father, Marcus, looked as though he had been physically struck across the face. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked from his father to me, trying to reconcile the daughter he thought was a penniless internet drifter with the phrase $15 million. My mother Brenda was the first one to desperately try and put the shattered pieces of her perfect world back together. She let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded completely unhinged in the dead, silent room. She leaned forward, waving her hand dismissively at Grandpa Langston, though her hand was shaking visibly. She said, "Oh, Dad, you are getting confused again. You must have misunderstood what Nia told you. Nia does not have a fund. She just does little freelance projects. Brad is the one who works at NovaStream. Brad is the one who just got the funding. You are just mixing up the names, Dad. It is time for your medication, I think." She looked around the table, practically begging anyone to agree with her narrative. But Grandpa Langston did not retreat. He did not let her gaslight him or protect her fragile worldview. He leaned forward, planting his elbows firmly on the table, projecting an absolute authority that no one dared challenge. He looked directly at my mother, his voice cold and steady like steel. He said, "I am not confused, Brenda. My mind is sharper than it has ever been. I know exactly what I am saying, and I know exactly who is sitting next to me. I have seen the legal paperwork. I have seen the Delaware incorporation documents. I watched her build Onyx Capital from the ground up, while you and Marcus were too busy calling her a failure to actually pay attention to her brilliance. So do not sit there and patronize me, and do not you dare patronize her ever again." He turned his sharp gaze back to Brad, who was currently gripping the edges of the table so hard his knuckles were completely white. Grandpa Langston pointed a weathered, calloused finger directly at the terrified tech executive. He said, "You wanted to throw my granddaughter a bone, Brad. You wanted to offer her a job answering phones. You should be down on your knees thanking God she does not fire you and your wife before dessert is even served. Because from where I am sitting, she is the one who signs your paychecks. She is the one who owns your company." The absolute finality in his voice was devastating. There was no room left for denial. He had laid out the truth with surgical precision, leaving my family completely exposed. The camera lens of my mind panned slowly across the table, taking in the beautiful destruction. The extravagant Christmas dinner, the honey-baked ham, the expensive crystal glasses, all of it faded into the background. The only thing that mattered was the sheer terror radiating from Brad and Jasmine. The entire foundation of their elite corporate identities had just been ripped out from under them by an elderly retired postal worker and the family outcast. I did not need to yell. I did not need to cry. I simply reached forward, picked up my glass of red wine, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the vintage wine wash over my tongue, savoring the absolute perfection of the moment. I lowered the glass, set it gently back onto the table, and finally broke my own silence. I looked directly into Brad and his terrified eyes offering him a calm, razor-sharp smile. I said, "Grandpa is entirely correct, Brad. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Onyx Capital Partners. We led your Series A funding round. We own 60% of NovaStream. So tell me again about that entry-level customer service role. I would love to hear more about how I can follow your standard operating procedures." The air in the room was completely electrified. I had pulled the trigger and the impact was absolutely spectacular. For a split second, Brad just stared at me, his brain completely unable to process the absolute reality of what I had just said. Then he threw his head back and let out a loud, barking laugh. It was a harsh, forced, completely unhinged sound that scraped against the walls of the dining room. He slapped his hand down flat against the mahogany table, shaking his head rapidly as he looked around at my parents and Jasmine. He was desperately searching for an audience, trying to manufacture a shared sense of amusement to cover up the sheer naked terror radiating from his own eyes. He pointed a finger at me, still forcing that hysterical chuckle through his teeth. He said, "Oh man, you really had me going there for a second, Nia. You actually had me. That was good. That was a really good joke. I mean, the delivery was absolutely flawless. You almost sounded like you knew what you were talking about." When nobody at the table joined in on his frantic laughter, Brad wiped a non-existent tear from his eye and turned his attention directly to my father. His tone shifted from fake amusement to deep, condescending concern. He said, "Marcus, real talk, you and Brenda really need to get Grandpa Langston evaluated by a medical professional. I am not even trying to be disrespectful right now, but the man is clearly losing his grip on reality. He is sitting here making up wild corporate fairy tales at the Christmas dinner table. Dementia is a very serious thing, Marcus. You cannot just let him sit here and feed into Nia and her massive delusions of grandeur." My mother immediately grabbed onto the lifeline Brad had just thrown her. She exhaled a loud, dramatic sigh of absolute relief, her hands fluttering to her chest as she nodded aggressively. She said, "Yes, exactly. Thank you, Brad. That is exactly what is happening here. Dad is just confused. His medication has been off all week. And Nia, shame on you. Shame on you for taking advantage of an elderly man and his declining mental state just to make yourself feel important for 5 minutes. You are so bitterly jealous of Jasmine and Brad that you would actually sit here and lie to our faces about owning a venture capital firm. It is beyond pathetic, Nia. It is a sickness." Brad felt deeply emboldened by my mother and her desperate validation. The color began to return to his face, replacing the pale, ghostly shock with a hot, angry red. He adjusted his fleece vest again, puffing his chest out as he glared at me across the crystal glasses and the fine china. He said, "You are capping, Nia. You are sitting here completely lying through your teeth because your ego cannot handle the fact that my wife is an executive and you are a complete failure. You think you can just throw around the name Onyx Capital Partners and what? We are just going to bow down to you. Do you even know how ridiculous you sound right now? You are a college dropout who works from a cheap apartment in her pajamas. You do not have $15 million. You do not even have $15,000. He was breathing heavily now, his manic energy completely taking over. He could not just let the lie die in the air. His fragile tech bro ego demanded absolute and total destruction. He needed to physically humiliate me, to crush me with empirical evidence so that my parents would go back to worshiping him as the ultimate savior of the family. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back so violently that it scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He said, "You know what? No. We are going to put an absolute end to this little fantasy right now. I am not going to let you sit here and disrespect my company and my wife with your pathetic lies." Brad stormed out of the dining room, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway toward the front foyer, where he had left his designer leather briefcase. My father called out to him, telling him to just sit down and ignore me, that I was not worth ruining the holiday dinner over. But Brad was already marching back into the room. He was holding his sleek silver corporate MacBook in his hands like it was a holy artifact. He marched right back to his seat and slammed the laptop down onto the dining table right next to his plate of half-eaten macaroni and cheese and the crystal gravy boat. It was a massive violation of my mother and her strict dinner table rules, but she did not say a single word. She just watched him, her eyes wide with nervous anticipation. Brad opened the laptop and aggressively typed in his password, hitting the return key so hard I thought the plastic might snap. He did not sit back down. He stood leaning over the keyboard, his face glowing in the harsh blue light of the screen. He said, "Let me educate you on how real business operates, Nia. Because in the actual tech industry, we do not just make wild, baseless claims to stroke our own egos. We rely on hard data. We rely on legal documentation. And I have full executive access to the capitalization table for NovaStream." He quickly navigated through his corporate dashboard, muttering tech jargon under his breath to sound as intimidating as possible. He said a cap table is a secure, legally binding ledger. It shows exactly who owns every single share of our company. It lists the founders, the employee options pool, and the institutional investors who actually provided our Series A funding. It is the absolute undeniable truth of the company structure. He clicked his mouse one final time, pulling up a complex spreadsheet filled with names, percentages, and dollar amounts. He grabbed the edges of his laptop and forcefully spun it around, shoving it across the white linen tablecloth so that the screen was facing directly at me. He tapped his index finger violently against the glass of the screen, pointing at the very top row of the spreadsheet. He said, "Read it, Nia." Read it out loud for the entire table. Who is the lead investor? Who owns 60% of the preferred shares? I did not move. I just looked at the screen, and then I looked calmly back up at his red, sweating face. Brad sneered, his voice dripping with absolute venom. He said, "I will read it for you since you clearly cannot process basic information. It says Onyx Capital Partners. It does not say Nia Jackson. It does not say your little freelance consulting agency. Onyx is a massive multi-million-dollar institutional fund run by serious Wall Street sharks who actually know how to manage capital. They are a faceless corporate entity operating out of a high-rise in Delaware. The people running Onyx are ruthless, aggressive business tycoons who would chew you up and spit you out before you even made it past their lobby security. They are not 32-year-old dropouts wearing unbranded sweaters. They have absolutely nothing to do with you, and you have absolutely nothing to do with them." He pulled the laptop back toward himself, slamming the lid shut with a loud, satisfying crack. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. He had presented his definitive proof. He had completely destroyed my ridiculous claim in front of my entire family. He said, "So please do us all a massive favor and stop trying to hijack my success. You are a failure, Nia. You have always been a failure, and lying about owning a venture capital firm is not going to magically change your bank account. It just makes you look desperate and completely unhinged. Now I suggest you apologize to my wife for trying to ruin her promotion dinner, and then I suggest you leave. Because quite frankly, your presence here is just depressing." Brad looked over at Jasmine, expecting her to smile back at him, expecting her to join in on the victory lap. But Jasmine was not smiling. Her face was the color of chalk. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with a dawning, absolute horror. Because unlike Brad, who only saw the name of the firm on the spreadsheet, Jasmine was the chief operating officer. She was the one who had handled the initial due diligence emails. and she was slowly realizing that the corporate attorney representing Onyx Capital had insisted on an absolute non-disclosure agreement regarding the identity of their managing partner. The room fell deadly silent again. Brad stood there proud and defiant, completely unaware that he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to finish the execution. I smiled. It was not a forced, frantic smile like the one Brad had just displayed. It was a genuine, relaxed expression of absolute control. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not scramble to defend myself against his ridiculous accusations. I simply reached down to the floor, where my leather tote bag was resting against the leg of my heavy wooden chair. I pulled out my silver tablet, unlocking the screen with a quick tap of my finger. Brad scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes as he crossed his arms even tighter over his chest. He asked me if I was going to show the table a motivational blog post about how to fake it until you make it. He told me to put the toy away and show some respect. I ignored him entirely. I tapped the screen casting icon on my tablet and selected the massive 85-inch smart television mounted on the wall in the adjacent living room. The television was perfectly visible from the dining table positioned directly behind where Brad was standing. The television chimed softly, automatically powering on. The sudden bright light from the massive screen cast a cool, sharp blue glow across the dining room, cutting right through the warm, traditional amber light of my mother and her crystal chandelier. Everyone turned their heads instinctively to look at the screen. The casual holiday atmosphere was completely dead, replaced by the sterile high-stakes tension of a corporate boardroom. I opened my secure files application. I said, "You are absolutely right about one thing, Brad. Real business does not operate on wild, baseless claims to stroke our own egos. It operates on legally binding documentation. And while a capitalization table is a cute little spreadsheet for middle management to look at, it is absolutely not the bottom of the rabbit hole. Institutional investors, especially stealth venture capital funds operating at my level, do not operate like amateur angel investors. We use complex layers of corporate protection holding companies and strict non-disclosure agreements to maintain our complete anonymity." I swiped across my screen, bringing up the official government portal for the State of Delaware Division of Corporations. I clicked on the corporate entity search bar and typed in Onyx Capital Partners. The massive television mirrored my every single move in flawless high definition. The search results populated instantly on the screen. I clicked on the Master Operating Agreement, the fully unredacted version that is kept strictly confidential from the general public and certainly kept entirely out of the hands of low-level sales executives like Brad. The official legal document appeared on the television screen, complete with government watermarks and filing stamps. I used my fingers to pinch and zoom in on the tablet, magnifying the bottom half of the final page so that the text was incredibly large. It was large enough for even my mother to read clearly from her seat at the far end of the dining table. I looked up at Brad, whose arrogant, victorious smirk had suddenly frozen into a rigid, painful grimace. I said, "Read it, Brad. Since you are the absolute expert on corporate structure and venture capital funding, please read the name of the sole managing member and chief executive officer of the fund that currently owns the majority of your entire professional existence." Brad turned his head slowly to look at the television behind him. He squinted at the glowing screen. The hot, angry red color that had flushed his cheeks just moments ago completely drained away, leaving his face the color of wet ash. His jaw went entirely slack and his mouth hung open as he read the bold black text on the screen. It clearly stated my full legal name, Nia Elizabeth Jackson. Right below my name was my official signature, followed by my title as Managing Partner and Founder of Onyx Capital Partners. Underneath that text was the exact same corporate seal that Brad had seen stamped on his Series A funding term sheets last month. It was undeniable. It was absolute empirical proof broadcast in 85 inches of high-definition reality. Jasmine let out a small, breathless gasp. It was a pathetic, broken sound like all the air had been violently punched straight out of her lungs. She slumped back heavily into her dining chair, her perfect posture completely collapsing. Her shoulders dropped, and she stared at the television with wide, unblinking eyes. The diamond-encrusted Rolex on her wrist, the one she had proudly flashed in my face just 30 minutes ago, suddenly looked incredibly heavy. It looked like a brilliant, sparkling shackle that she had unknowingly clamped onto her own arm. As the chief operating officer, she actually understood the terrifying magnitude of what was on that screen. She knew that as the majority shareholder and the head of the venture capital firm that funded them, I held absolute power. I had the legal authority to freeze company assets, terminate executive contracts, block their bonuses, and dissolve the entire board of directors. Her lavish lifestyle, her expensive vacations, her entire elite tech identity was resting squarely in the palm of my hand. My father stood up slowly from his chair. His expensive linen napkin slipped off his lap and fell silently to the hardwood floor. He walked 2 steps closer to the living room, taking his reading glasses out of the breast pocket of his shirt and sliding them onto his face with shaking hands. He stared at the television screen as if it were an alien artifact that had just crash-landed in his house. He traced his fingers through the empty air, mimicking the letters of my name on the document. He whispered my name softly to himself, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the wealth and power sitting right at his dining table. The daughter he had just called a massive disappointment, the woman he had just lectured about the value of a steady paycheck, was a multi-million-dollar titan. His brain simply could not process the paradigm shift. My mother was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly that her knuckles were entirely translucent. She looked at the television, then back at me, then back at the television. The perfectly constructed social hierarchy of her family had just been detonated. She had spent the entire evening worshiping Brad, treating him like royalty, and treating me like the family servant. Now she was staring at the undeniable proof that her golden child and her perfect son-in-law were nothing more than my employees. The shock was so profound that she could not even form a coherent sentence. She just sat there, her mouth opening and closing silently. I set my tablet face down onto the table. I folded my hands together and looked directly at Brad, who was still staring at the screen like a deer caught in the headlights of a speeding freight train. I said when I dropped out of my Ivy League business program 5 years ago, I did not do it because I lacked ambition. I did not do it because I could not handle the pressure. I did it because I realized the professors teaching me about venture capital had never actually built a fund themselves. I wanted to build something completely untethered from the rigid, outdated expectations of this family. So I started advising early-stage tech startups in exchange for equity instead of taking cash. I took massive risks while everyone else played it safe. I built a highly lucrative portfolio. And when those early startups went public or got acquired, I took my massive payouts and quietly formed Onyx Capital. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, making sure Brad and Jasmine felt the absolute crushing weight of my presence. I lowered my voice, speaking with a calm, deadly authority that commanded the entire room. I said I structured the firm as a stealth entity precisely to avoid this exact type of toxic family drama. I wanted to be evaluated in the boardroom based on my capital and my strategy, not my gender, my race, or my last name. I move in silence because power does not need to scream for attention. So when your little startup came across my desk looking for a Series A financial lifeline, I immediately recognized the company name. I authorized the investment, but I ordered my legal team to wrap the entire deal in strict non-disclosure agreements. I did that specifically so that you and Jasmine would never know you were pitching your entire corporate future to the sister you love to humiliate. The dining room was absolutely motionless. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, marking the seconds of their total defeat. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The heavy, suffocating arrogance that had filled the room just moments before had been completely incinerated. I was no longer the black sheep sitting quietly in the corner of the table. I was the absolute apex predator, and I had just locked the doors to the cage. The silence that followed my revelations stretched until it became physically agonizing. The air in the dining room felt completely stagnant, heavy with the suffocating realization of what I had just accomplished. Jasmine was the first person to attempt to break the tension, though attempt was an incredibly generous word for the pathetic display she put on. She opened her mouth, closed it, and swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. The confident, articulate chief operating officer, who had just spent an hour lecturing me on corporate synergy and executive leadership, was completely gone. In her place sat a terrified, stammering woman whose entire constructed reality was collapsing around her. She finally managed to force a sound out of her mouth, her voice trembling so badly she sounded like a frightened child. She said, "Nia, I do not understand. This makes absolutely no sense. If you are the managing partner of Onyx Capital, why did you not just tell us? We are your family. We are your own flesh and blood." She reached her hand out across the wide mahogany table, her fingers twitching nervously. The diamond-encrusted Rolex caught the ambient light from the chandelier one last pathetic time. She stammered again, saying we had due diligence meetings. Brad and I presented our quarterly financial models to the Onyx Board of Directors. Why did you hide behind lawyers? We could have celebrated this massive deal together as a family. I would never have said those harsh things to you if I knew you were the one who saved my company. I would have thanked you properly. I just stared at her outstretched hand. I did not move a single muscle to meet it. Her conditional love was so transparent it was almost offensive. I did not interrupt her rambling because I wanted her to hear exactly how desperate she sounded. She was not apologizing for being a cruel, condescending sister. She was only apologizing because she had just realized she was being cruel to her boss. Before Jasmine could embarrass herself any further, my father suddenly sprang into action. It was a remarkable, almost terrifying psychological pivot. The man who had just aggressively demanded I accept a minimum wage customer service job abruptly smoothed down his silk tie and cleared his throat loudly. The heavy, dark disappointment that had clouded his face all evening vanished entirely. It was instantly replaced by a wide, forced, and entirely fake smile of deep paternal pride. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back and walked around the edge of the large dining table, stepping right over his dropped linen napkin, and positioned himself closer to me. He raised his hands in a grand gesture of surrender and laughed heartily. It was a rich, booming laugh that echoed off the dining room walls, sounding so incredibly out of place amidst the absolute devastation of the room. He said, "Well, I have to admit, you really pulled a massive one over on us, Nia. You really did get us." He looked over at my mother, nodding enthusiastically, as if they were sharing a wonderful, heartwarming family moment instead of a total shift in power. He said, "Brenda, look at our oldest daughter. Just look at what she has built in secret. Did I not always say she had the absolute sharpest mind in this entire family? I always knew it. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness, Nia." My father placed his hand on the back of my chair, leaning in close, smelling heavily of expensive bourbon and cheap hypocrisy. He said, "You dropping out of Wharton, the intense secrecy, the independent consulting gigs, it was all part of a brilliant master plan. You were playing four-dimensional chess, while the rest of us were just playing checkers." He patted my chair, his voice swelling with manufactured emotion and fake admiration. He said, "You are the absolute pride of the family, Nia. You took the fundamental lessons about hard work, determination, and financial independence that I taught you growing up, and you applied them perfectly. You did it your own way, and you beat the system. I could not possibly be more proud of the brilliant woman you have become. We need to open a bottle of vintage champagne right now. We need to celebrate Onyx Capital Partners properly." He even tried to rationalize his previous insults. He chuckled nervously and said, "You know, everything we said to you tonight, it was just tough love, Nia. We push you hard because we know your absolute potential. We just wanted to light a fire under you to make sure you were not settling for less than you deserve." And clearly, our tough love worked beautifully. I slowly turned my head to look at his hand resting on the polished wood of my chair. Then I looked up into his eyes. The fake warmth in his expression faltered immediately under my cold, unblinking stare. I did not smile. I did not laugh at his terrible joke. I did not accept his desperate, transparent olive branch. I said, "Do not touch my chair, Marcus." And do not dare pretend for a single second that you had absolutely anything to do with my success. You do not get to claim the finish line when you spent the entire race actively trying to break my legs. My father slowly pulled his hand back, as if the wood had suddenly caught fire, the fake smile freezing permanently on his face. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the absolute truth cut through his pathetic attempt at emotional manipulation. I said 5 minutes ago, you called me a massive failure. You said I had zero discipline, zero ambition, and zero respect for corporate authority. You said I was a broke, unemployed drifter, living in complete denial. You sat right there at the head of this table and told me to swallow my massive pride and beg Brad for an entry-level job answering phones, because it was the only way I would ever amount to anything in this lifetime. I leaned forward, making sure he heard every single syllable loud and clear. I said you did not see four-dimensional chess 5 minutes ago. You saw a convenient target. You saw someone you could comfortably step on to make yourself feel infinitely better about your own stalled banking career. You did not praise my sharp mind when I left the Wharton program. You called me an unforgivable embarrassment to the family name. You only decided I was the pride of the family the exact second you saw $15 million attached to my legal identity. Your tough love is a complete myth. It was just plain unfiltered cruelty. I turned my attention across the table to my mother Brenda, who was still sitting frozen in a state of absolute shock. I said, "And do not think I forgot your speech either. You just spent 30 minutes dissecting my private lifestyle, telling me my clothes were cheap, my apartment was pathetic, and that no elite man of substance would ever want to marry me. You told me I needed to take detailed notes from Jasmine because she knew how to build a real family legacy. Well, take a good look at your golden child now. I am the legacy. I built the empire that funded her perfect little corporate fantasy." I looked back at my father. He was shifting his weight nervously from side to side, completely exposed. He tried to speak, tried to formulate another weak excuse about family bonds and forgiveness, but I cut him off immediately. I said, "Your pride is completely worthless to me now. It is entirely transactional. You only respect power, and you only respect money. For 5 years, I gave you every single opportunity to love me simply because I was your daughter. I sat at this table every single holiday, quietly eating my dinner, taking your endless insults and letting you treat me like a second-class citizen. I did not ask you for a single dime of your money. I did not ask for your professional connections. I just wanted basic human decency. But that was apparently too expensive for you to give." The silence returned, but this time it was permanent. My father looked down at his expensive leather shoes, completely stripped of his patriarchal authority. Jasmine was quietly wiping a tear from her cheek, finally realizing that the diamond Rolex on her wrist could not shield her from reality. They had played their superior roles perfectly all evening, and now the stage curtain had completely fallen. They had absolutely nothing left to say because there was no lie left to hide behind. The power dynamic was permanently locked. They were entirely at my mercy, and they knew I had none left to give. My mother was not like my father. Marcus was a coward who would instantly bow to whoever held the most capital in the room. But Brenda was a woman whose entire psychological framework relied on maintaining absolute dominance over her children. As the suffocating silence stretched on, I watched her mind frantically calculate a way out of the corner I had just painted her into. She could not accept defeat. She could not accept that I was fundamentally better and far more successful than her golden child. So she did what every classic narcissist does when confronted with undeniable, irrefutable truth. She completely flipped the script and made herself the ultimate victim of the situation. Brenda suddenly pushed her chair back, the heavy wood scraping harshly against the polished floor. She did not stand up, but she leaned far across the massive dining table, her face flushing with a deep, furious red. The initial shock in her eyes morphed directly into pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand flat onto the table, rattling the fine china in her crystal wineglass. She said, "How dare you? How absolutely dare you sit there and speak to your father like that? And how dare you do this to us? She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, her voice rising in pitch until it was practically a shriek echoing through the room. She said you sat there for 5 entire years pretending to be poor. You let us worry sick about your future. You let your own mother lose sleep at night, agonizing over what was going to happen to you because you stubbornly refused to get a real job. You intentionally deceived your own flesh and blood just so you could set up this sick, twisted little ambush at a family holiday dinner. You are completely malicious, Nia. You are an absolute sociopath. I let her yell. I did not interrupt her. It was genuinely fascinating to watch her rewrite our family history in real time. She had never lost a single second of sleep worrying about my well-being or my happiness. She had only ever worried about how my perceived failure made her look to her elite friends at the country club. She continued her aggressive tirade, her breathing becoming heavy and ragged. She said you knew Brad and Jasmine were working at NovaStream. You knew it perfectly well, and instead of calling your sister and celebrating this massive investment, you hid behind corporate lawyers like a coward. You let them walk into those boardrooms and pitch their hearts out to your employees, while you probably sat in your luxury office and laughed at them. You intentionally orchestrated this entire evening just to humiliate your sister in front of her own husband. It is disgusting. It is the most vindictive, hateful thing I have ever seen a human being do to their own family. She took a deep, shaky breath, adjusting her expensive pearl necklace, as if trying to physically restore her own shattered maternal authority. Her eyes darted rapidly between me, the glowing television screen in the living room, still boldly displaying my corporate ownership documents, and the terrified pale faces of Brad and Jasmine. Her brain was working overtime to figure out how to extract maximum financial value from a situation she no longer controlled. To Brenda, wealth was never something earned through individual sacrifice or brilliant strategy. Wealth was simply a communal family asset, provided she was the one dictating exactly how it was distributed. She said, "But fine, fine. If this is the reality we are dealing with now, then we are going to fix it. We are going to fix it right now, tonight, before anyone leaves this dining table." She looked at me with an expression of absolute breathtaking entitlement, completely erasing the reality that she had zero leverage in this negotiation. She said, "You are the boss. You own the venture capital fund that owns their company. That means you have the absolute power to make things right. You have put your younger sister through immense psychological trauma tonight. You have completely humiliated her husband and undermined his confidence. If you want to remain a part of this family, if you want me to ever forgive you for this ridiculous and cruel deception, you are going to compensate them for the emotional damage you have just done." I tilted my head, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. I was genuinely curious to see exactly how deep her delusion ran. I asked her what exactly she thought adequate compensation looked like. Brenda did not even hesitate. She spoke with the crisp, demanding tone of a wealthy customer complaining to a retail manager. She said, "First of all, you are going to give Jasmine an immediate and substantial raise. She is the chief operating officer of your company, and she works grueling, exhausting hours to make sure your investment is profitable. You are going to double her base salary effective tomorrow morning. She deserves to be paid appropriately for the incredible value she brings to your portfolio, and she should not have to worry about paying off her car or her credit cards when her sister is a multimillionaire." She held up a second finger, her eyes wide and manic with greed. She said, "Secondly, you are going to transfer 5% of the total company equity directly to Jasmine and Brad. And I do not mean employee stock options that vest over 4 or 5 years. I mean 5% fully vested, transferred legally into their personal names by the end of this week. It is a tiny fraction of what you own, Nia. You will not even notice it is gone from your massive portfolio. But it will give them the absolute financial security they deserve after you so viciously threatened their livelihood and their professional pride tonight." My mother looked over at Brad, offering him a look of deep maternal sympathy, completely ignoring the fact that he was currently sweating through his shirt in absolute terror. She looked back at me and said, "Brad is a brilliant salesman. He just told us he secured a massive Series A funding round, which apparently was your money. You should be thanking him for bringing such a lucrative deal directly to your doorstep." Giving them 5% of the company is the absolute least you can do to show your appreciation for his hard work. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, completely satisfied with her ridiculous demands. She actually believed she was being generous by allowing me to buy my way back into her good graces. She truly thought she could still command me like a disobedient teenager. She said, "It is the only way to protect our family harmony, Nia. It is the only way we can move past this incredibly toxic behavior of yours and go back to being a normal, loving family. You owe us this. We raised you. We fed you. We put a roof over your head and paid for your undergraduate degree. You have millions of dollars sitting in a bank account that you do not even need because you live like a complete hermit. Your sister is out here trying to build a real legacy and a real life. You are going to give them the equity, you are going to double her salary, and you are going to apologize to Brad for disrespecting his professional integrity." She leaned forward one last time, her voice dropping into a harsh, threatening whisper. She said, "If you do not agree to these terms right now, you can get up from this table, walk out that front door, and never come back. I will never speak to you again, and you will be completely dead to this family." The absolute audacity of her demands hung in the air, mixing with the scent of the holiday food that had long since gone cold on our plates. She had just issued the ultimate maternal ultimatum. She was threatening me with the exact same isolation and abandonment that had terrified me when I was a child. She thought the threat of losing my family would force me to open my checkbook and surrender my power to the golden child. She thought I was still desperately craving her conditional love. I looked at her, truly seeing her for the very first time. I did not see a mother. I saw a parasite who was furious that the host had suddenly grown armor. I slowly reached into my leather tote bag on the floor, my hand wrapping around the thick, heavy manila folder I had brought with me. I pulled the folder up and placed it gently onto the mahogany table. It was time to show them exactly what I thought about Brad and his supposed professional integrity. I did not raise my voice in response to my mother and her hysterical threats. I did not need to. True power does not throw tantrums at the dinner table. It presents undeniable, catastrophic evidence. I kept my eyes locked on Brenda as my hand gripped the thick, heavy manila folder hidden inside my leather tote bag. I pulled it out slowly, letting the sheer physical volume of the document register with everyone in the room. It was nearly 2 inches thick, bound tightly with heavy black metal clips, and stamped with a bold red confidential warning across the front cover. I lifted the folder slightly and let it drop onto the mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the silent room, sounding exactly like a judge bringing down a wooden gavel. I placed my hand flat on top of the smooth manila cover and pushed it firmly across the polished wood. It slid past the crystal water glasses, past the silver gravy boat, and stopped dead right next to Brad and his half-eaten plate of macaroni and cheese. I looked back at my mother, who was staring at the folder as if a poisonous snake had just been released onto her pristine dining table. "I said you want me to protect family harmony. You want me to reward Jasmine with a massive salary increase, and you want me to hand over 5% of my company equity to Brad because he is supposedly a brilliant salesman who brought a lucrative deal to my doorstep. You are sitting there issuing ultimatums and threatening to disown me because your entire demand is based on the absolute delusion that they are actually good at their jobs. It is based on the assumption that I invested $15 million into NovaStream because I looked at their quarterly reports and saw a thriving, healthy business." I slowly shook my head, offering my mother a cold, completely empty smile. I said, "Venture capital is not a charity, Brenda. And I am certainly not an angel investor who hands out millions of dollars to fund my sister and her lavish fake lifestyle." When the NovaStream pitch deck originally crossed my desk at Onyx Capital 6 months ago, I immediately recognized the names on the executive roster. But I did not authorize the funding round because I trusted Brad. I did not look at his ridiculous sales projections and think he was a corporate genius. I authorized the funding because the underlying software technology that the actual engineers built was incredibly valuable, but the financial structure built on top of it by the management team was completely rotten. I could smell the rot from 50 miles away. Brad was staring at the thick manila folder, his breathing shallow and rapid. He did not make any move to touch it. His hands remained frozen in his lap. I turned my attention entirely to him, systematically stripping away the last remaining layers of his arrogant tech executive persona. I said you stood in front of my board of directors last month, Brad. You wore a custom-tailored suit, you flashed that cheesy, overconfident smile, and you boldly presented a massive deck of charts showing record-breaking user acquisition and exponential revenue growth. You thought you charmed the room. You thought you manipulated a group of faceless Wall Street sharks into handing you a blank check because of your sheer aggressive alpha mindset. You actually believed you outsmarted the system. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together in my lap, projecting an aura of absolute, immovable authority. I said you did not charm anyone. We gave you the capital because we needed to secure a controlling interest on the board of directors. We needed the absolute legal authority to bypass your executive gatekeeping, open up the restricted books, and see exactly how deep the infection went. That $15 million investment was not a reward for your hard work. It was a Trojan horse. The day the ink dried on that wire transfer, I did not throw a celebration party. I picked up the phone and hired a private team of independent forensic accountants from a top-tier corporate intelligence firm in New York. Jasmine let out another quiet, pathetic gasp, pressing her manicured fingers against her mouth. As the chief operating officer, she knew exactly what the term forensic accounting meant. It was not a standard annual audit where sleepy accountants just check the basic math on a spreadsheet to ensure compliance. Forensic accountants are financial bloodhounds. They are ruthless, highly trained investigators who are brought in specifically to tear apart every single transaction trace, every single digital footprint, and uncover the active fraud that careless executives try to hide. I kept my eyes locked on Brad, refusing to let him look away. I said for the last 3 weeks, while you two were busy taking lavish weekend trips, buying diamond Rolex watches, and laughing about my pathetic internet side hustles, my team of investigators was living inside your corporate servers. They did not just look at your official balance sheets. They pulled the raw, unedited data from your payment processing software. They subpoenaed the bank records of your third-party vendors. They tracked the exact IP addresses used to authorize every single expense report, and they matched them to your personal corporate credit cards. They ripped up the floorboards of your entire operation, and they documented every single lie you have told for the last 2 years. My father Marcus reached out with a trembling hand, adjusting his reading glasses as he stared at the red confidential stamp on the folder. He asked in a weak, raspy voice what exactly was inside the document. The aggressive lecturing patriarch from an hour ago was completely gone, replaced by a terrified man realizing his golden idols were made of cheap plastic. I did not look at my father. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on the terrified white tech executive sitting across from me. I said that dossier is not a routine performance review, Brad. It is a comprehensive financial autopsy. It contains 300 pages of irrefutable, legally binding evidence detailing exactly how you and Jasmine have been systematically destroying the company from the inside out. It proves that you are not brilliant business minds. You are corporate parasites. And you have just handed the exterminator the keys to the entire building. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but she could not find the words. Her threat of cutting me off from the family hung dead in the air, completely neutralized by the sheer magnitude of the trap I had sprung. I had not just matched her psychological manipulation, I had brought the overwhelming force of the federal financial system to a family Christmas dinner. I gestured gracefully toward the heavy folder sitting next to Brad and his plate. I told him to go ahead and open it. I told him I wanted him to see exactly what kind of return on investment Onyx Capital was about to extract from him. I wanted him to read the specific numbers that were going to end his entire career. Brad did not reach for the manila folder. He stared at the bold, red, confidential stamp as if it were a live grenade resting right next to his dinner plate. A thick bead of sweat formed at his hairline, tracking slowly down the side of his pale face. He swallowed hard, his throat making a loud, audible clicking sound in the deadly quiet dining room. He was completely paralyzed. He knew exactly what was inside those pages, and his sheer physical terror confirmed everything for my parents. I did not wait for him to find his courage. I simply reached across the table, grabbed the edge of the heavy cover, and flipped it open myself. I said, "Since you are suddenly so quiet, Brad, I will be happy to present the executive summary for the table. Let us talk about the magnificent sales record you were bragging about just an hour ago. When Onyx Capital first started looking at NovaStream, your user acquisition cost was bleeding the company dry. The actual software product was decent, but nobody was buying the enterprise-level subscriptions. Your organic sales had completely flatlined for 6 consecutive months. But you were the vice president of sales. Your entire identity, your massive salary, and your heavily leveraged lifestyle depended on securing a Series A funding round. You were sitting at family dinners like this one, drinking expensive bourbon and bragging to my parents about being a killer in the boardroom, while in reality, you were failing spectacularly. You knew that institutional investors only write checks for companies demonstrating hypergrowth. So, when you could not find real customers to buy the software, you decided to simply invent them. I turned to the first tabbed section of the dossier, resting my finger on a highlighted column of financial data. I said 3 months before you pitched to Onyx Capital, you incorporated 3 separate limited liability companies in the state of Wyoming. You used a cheap registered agent service to hide your identity, naming them Apex Solutions, Horizon Digital, and Summit Logistics. They sounded like perfectly legitimate tech startups, but they had absolutely no employees, no physical offices, no payroll, and no actual products. They were nothing but digital ghosts created for the sole purpose of deceiving investors. I flipped to the next page where a complex flowchart clearly mapped out the illegal movement of capital. I said you took out a massive personal loan, combined it with funds you quietly siphoned from the NovaStream operational budget, and you wired that money directly into the bank accounts of those 3 shell companies. Then, wearing your hat as the vice president of sales, you drafted massive multi-year enterprise software contracts. You had Apex Horizon and Summit purchase thousands of premium software licenses from NovaStream. You essentially used company money to buy company software. You effectively round-tripped the capital to create the illusion of explosive organic sales. I looked around the table. My father was holding his breath, his eyes glued to the documents. My mother was clutching her linen napkin to her chest, her face completely drained of color. Jasmine was staring at the table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, her hands trembling violently in her lap. I looked back at Brad. I said you recorded those fraudulent purchases as legitimate recurring annual revenue. You artificially inflated the NovaStream valuation by millions of dollars. You even generated thousands of fake employee email addresses to log into the system, creating ghost users, so the software usage metrics would look authentic to any auditor who did not look closely enough. You took those doctored financial spreadsheets, you put them into a sleek presentation deck, and you used them to defraud my venture capital firm out of $15 million. In the corporate world, Brad, we do not call that a strategic pivot. We call it federal wire fraud. The word fraud hung in the air, heavy and absolutely suffocating. Brad finally snapped out of his silent paralysis. The sheer instinct for self-preservation kicked in, but it was a clumsy, desperate panic. He aggressively loosened the collar of his button-down shirt, practically ripping his expensive fleece vest open. He was sweating profusely now, large, dark patches forming under the arms of his shirt and soaking through the fabric. He threw his hands up in the air, his voice cracking as he tried to speak over me. He said, No, you are completely misunderstanding the growth strategy. You are taking standard operational bootstrapping and twisting it to sound illegal. Those were not shell companies, Nia. They were strategic beta testing sandboxes. We needed discrete, closed-loop environments to stress test the enterprise server load before we rolled out the software to the public market. It is standard tech industry practice. We were utilizing channel distribution metrics to simulate user volume and establish baseline performance indicators. He was talking incredibly fast, throwing out every single buzzword he could remember, hoping the sheer volume of technical jargon would confuse the room. He said you do not understand software as a service architecture. You are looking at a beta testing sandbox and calling it fraud because you do not understand the technical synergy of our deployment phase. We had to calculate hypothetical churn rates against customer acquisition costs. It is highly advanced financial modeling. He looked desperately at my father, trying to find an ally, trying to appeal to the older man and his limited knowledge of the tech industry. Brad said, Marcus, tell her. Tell her that in the tech world, you have to spend capital to simulate growth metrics. It is a closed-loop ecosystem. It is totally legal and completely necessary for stress testing. She is just trying to frame me because she has always hated me. She is twisting standard development protocols to make me look like a criminal. I did not even blink. I did not let him hide behind his pathetic wall of corporate buzzwords. I reached into the folder, pulled out a thick stack of printed server logs, and threw them directly across the table. The heavy stack of paper scattered over his plate, covering his untouched food in undeniable black and white data. I said beta testing sandboxes do not require you to forge digital signatures on binding enterprise contracts, Brad. Beta testing sandboxes do not require you to funnel $2.4 million through offshore payment processors to obscure the origin of the funds, and they certainly do not explain why the Internet Protocol addresses used to authorize every single one of those fake software purchases traced directly back to the primary wireless router located inside your personal residence. Brad stopped talking instantly. His mouth hung open, but the buzzwords had completely evaporated. The manic energy drained out of him, leaving only the terrifying realization that he was entirely trapped. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp whisper. I said you authorized the purchase orders from your own living room, Brad. My forensic team matched the timestamps on the fraudulent wire transfers to the exact moments your personal laptop was connected to your home network. We matched the media access control addresses of your specific devices. We have the encrypted emails you sent to the registered agent in Wyoming, begging them to expedite the limited liability company formations before the Onyx Capital due diligence period began. We recovered the deleted spreadsheets where you calculated exactly how much fake revenue you needed to hit your quarterly bonus target. We have every single keystroke. I tapped my index finger hard against the solid wood of the table, emphasizing every single word. I said so, do not sit there and insult my intelligence with made-up phrases like technical synergy and closed-loop ecosystems. You are not a brilliant software architect. You are not an elite tech executive. You are a common thief who got desperate when you realized you could not actually sell a product to save your own life. You committed massive financial fraud, and you left a digital paper trail so incredibly wide that a blind man could follow it straight to your front door. Brad sat entirely frozen in his chair, his chest heaving under his sweat-soaked shirt. The dining room was absolutely silent except for the soft, steady crackle of the faux fireplace in the adjacent living room. I did not give them a single moment to breathe or attempt to formulate another lie. I had systematically dismantled the vice president of sales, and now it was time to address the other half of this fraudulent power couple. I turned my head slowly, moving my gaze away from Brad and his terrified face, and locked my eyes directly onto my younger sister. Jasmine had pressed herself so far back into her heavy wooden dining chair that she looked like she was trying to physically merge with the upholstery. The confident, radiant chief operating officer, who had commanded the room just an hour ago, was entirely gone. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly panicked. When my eyes locked onto hers, she visibly flinched. She immediately tried to distance herself from the wreckage of her husband. She threw Brad under the bus without a single second of hesitation, proving exactly how shallow their elite tech marriage truly was. She shook her head rapidly, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. She said, "Nia, you have to believe me. I had absolutely no idea what Brad was doing with those shell companies. I am just the chief operating officer. I handle internal logistics and human resources. Brad runs the sales department entirely on his own. I never looked at the Wyoming incorporation documents. He lied to me too. He lied to all of us." I let out a low, dry chuckle. It was a cold sound that made my mother flinch in her seat. I said, "You really are incredible, Jasmine. Your husband and his entire professional life are actively burning to the ground in front of you, and your very first instinct is to toss gasoline on him so you can try to sneak out the back door. But you are not sneaking out of anything tonight. Because my forensic accounting team did not just look at the incoming revenue streams. They spent a massive amount of time looking at the outgoing expenses." I reached across the table and pulled the thick manila folder away from Brad. I flipped past the massive section detailing the wire fraud and opened a new tab labeled Executive Expenditures. I said, "You claim you only handle internal logistics. So let us take a very close look at your incredible logistical skills. Let us talk about that brilliant diamond-encrusted Rolex currently wrapped around your left wrist. The one you proudly shoved in my face earlier this evening. The one you said Brad bought for you as a promotion gift because you practically carried the company on your back this quarter." Jasmine instinctively grabbed her left wrist with her right hand. She tried desperately to cover the sparkling watch, pulling her arm down into her lap, as if hiding the jewelry from my sight would somehow erase the financial records sitting right in front of me. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder and held it up in the air. I said, "This is the itemized statement for the NovaStream Corporate American Express card. The specific card that was issued solely for covering authorized software development expenses and critical server maintenance. 3 weeks ago, a charge was made at a luxury jeweler in downtown Atlanta for $28,500. The cardholder's signature on the digital receipt belongs to Jasmine Bradley." My mother gasped loudly, her hand flying to cover her mouth. I kept reading the document, my voice projecting clearly across the room. I said, "You did not just buy the watch with stolen investor capital. You actually logged into the corporate accounting software and categorized a $28,000 diamond Rolex under the budget code for advanced cybersecurity software licenses. You thought no one would ever verify the individual vendor codes. You thought you could just use my Series A funding injection as your own personal piggy bank to fund your luxury lifestyle." Jasmine was shaking her head, sobbing openly now. She said, "No, that was a mistake. It was a simple accounting error, Nia. I meant to use my personal credit card at the jeweler. I was going to reimburse the company account at the end of the month. You have to believe me." I did not let her finish her pathetic, insulting excuse. I dropped the American Express statement onto the table and pulled out a thick stack of vehicle lease agreements. I said, "Was the Tesla an accounting error too, Jasmine? Because according to these luxury dealership records, the massive down payment and the ongoing monthly lease installments for your brand new electric vehicle are being automatically drafted from the NovaStream employee payroll account. You are literally paying for your luxury car using the exact money that is supposed to fund the health insurance premiums for your actual software engineers." I reached back into the folder and pulled out another thick stack of receipts, fanning them out across the polished mahogany table so everyone could see the sheer volume of her theft. I said, "What about the Michelin star dinners you bragged about earlier? The weekend trips to Europe that you love to post about on the internet? The designer silk blouses you wear to the office to look like a powerful executive? Every single luxury item that you used to project this image of absolute elite corporate success was paid for with embezzled funds. You do not have a massive executive salary. You have a massive corporate theft operation." My father was staring at Jasmine with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The golden child, the daughter who could do absolutely no wrong. The woman who had followed his strict playbook for success to the letter was sitting there completely exposed as a common criminal. The meticulously crafted mask of perfection that she had worn her entire life had just shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces right before his eyes. He realized in that exact moment that everything he had praised her for was entirely fake. I looked directly at my mother, whose face was completely pale. I said, "Do you understand now, Brenda? Do you see exactly why I am not going to double her salary or hand her 5% of my company equity to protect your precious family harmony? Your perfect daughter is a thief. She breached her fiduciary duty to the board of directors. She engaged in gross embezzlement of corporate funds, And she did it all while looking down her nose at me, mocking me for wearing plain cashmere sweaters and living in a modest apartment. She funded her superiority complex with my money. Jasmine completely collapsed. She folded her arms on the dining table and buried her face in them, sobbing hysterically. Her perfect blonde highlights were a mess, her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled, and the confident, mocking tone she had used to tell me I could not handle a real career in tech was entirely gone. She sounded exactly like a terrified little girl who had finally been caught stealing from the cookie jar. Except this cookie jar contained millions of dollars of federal wire transfers. I looked at the two of them sitting across from me. The ultimate power couple. Brad was staring blankly at the wall, completely catatonic, his fleece vest soaked in cold sweat. Jasmine was crying uncontrollably into the fine linen tablecloth. The elite tech empire they had aggressively bragged about all evening had been completely dismantled, exposed as a pathetic criminal enterprise. I kept my voice perfectly steady, ensuring that every single word landed with maximum psychological impact. I said you told me earlier that not everyone can handle a real career in tech. You said it takes a certain level of intellect and grit to survive in the boardroom. Well, you are about to find out exactly how much grit you actually have, because the corporate world does not forgive embezzlement, and it certainly does not care about your golden child status. You built your entire life on a foundation of absolute lies, and I just pulled the final pillar out from under you. The total destruction of their elite tech facade hung heavily in the dining room, but Brad was not entirely finished. Like a cornered animal realizing the trap has already snapped shut on its leg, his initial shock rapidly mutated into a desperate, chaotic rage. He could not accept that he had been completely outsmarted by the woman he had spent the entire evening insulting. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back so violently that it tipped over and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. He did not bother to pick it up. He stood towering over the dining table, his face flushing a dark, dangerous shade of purple. The polished, condescending tech executive was gone, replaced by a terrified man willing to say absolutely anything to survive. He slammed both of his hands down flat onto the table, leaning aggressively toward me. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his voice rising into a frantic, aggressive shout. He said, "You are completely out of your mind. You think you can just print out a bunch of fake spreadsheets and accuse me of a federal crime. You think I do not know what you are doing. You hacked into my personal home network. You illegally accessed my private communications and fabricated this entire digital paper trail just to frame me. That is corporate espionage, Nia. That is a massive cybercrime, and you are going to go to federal prison for this." He turned to my father, his eyes wide and wild, actively playing the victim of a malicious conspiracy. He said, "Marcus, listen to me. You have to listen to me. She is completely insane. She is so deeply jealous of Jasmine and me that she manufactured this entire audit to destroy our lives. She cannot handle the fact that we are successful and she is entirely alone. I was trying to protect the company. I was trying to ensure we hit our valuation targets so the employees could keep their jobs. Everything I did was for the survival of the startup. And now she is illegally hacking my personal router to tear down her own family." When my father did not immediately jump to his defense, Brad pivoted back to me, escalating his attack to the only weapon he thought he still had left. He bared his teeth, practically spitting his words across the table. He said, "I am going to sue you for every single penny you have ever made. I am going to hire the most vicious corporate litigators in the entire state of Georgia. I will file a massive lawsuit against you and Onyx Capital for defamation, slander, and tortious interference with a business contract. You are making completely baseless, defamatory claims in front of witnesses. I will drag you through civil court for the next 10 years. I will completely liquidate your precious venture capital fund, and when I am finished with you, you will be begging me for that minimum wage customer service job." He looked down at his wife, who was still sobbing hysterically into the tablecloth. He grabbed her shoulder, shaking her roughly. He told Jasmine to stop crying immediately. He said, "Look at me, Jasmine. We are not going to let her do this. We are going to counter-sue her for emotional distress. We are going to take her entire fund and walk away with millions. She has absolutely no idea who she is messing with." I sat perfectly still, letting his frantic threats wash over me like a light breeze. I did not flinch when he slammed his hands on the table. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I simply waited for him to run out of breath. When his chest was heaving, and the dining room fell silent except for Jasmine and her quiet sobs, I finally spoke. My voice was calm, measured, and entirely devoid of emotion. I said, "You can save your legal threats for someone who actually finds them intimidating, Brad. You are throwing around terms like defamation and tortious interference because you watched a legal drama on television. But let me explain how the actual legal system works. Defamation requires a false statement presented as fact. Every single word in that forensic audit is the absolute documented truth. Truth is an absolute defense in any civil court. And as the majority shareholder of NovaStream, I did not hack your network. I exercised my legal right to audit the company infrastructure. The board of directors authorized the forensic investigation. You signed a standard employment contract granting the company full access to monitor and review all digital activity conducted on company servers. You gave us the keys to your own destruction the day you signed your executive agreement. I picked up my glass of red wine, took a small sip, and set it down precisely on the coaster. I looked directly into his frantic, bloodshot eyes. I said, "But you are still operating under a massive delusion. You are standing in my mother and her dining room screaming at me because you think this is still a family dispute. You think we are going to argue about this over the Christmas ham, and then my parents are going to force us to compromise to protect the family reputation. You think you can threaten me with a civil lawsuit and bully me into bearing this audit." I leaned forward, folding my hands together on top of the mahogany table. I lowered my voice, delivering the final crushing blow with absolute precision. I said, "This is no longer a family matter, Brad. It stopped being a family matter the exact second I verified you were stealing investor capital to artificially inflate your corporate valuation. Onyx Capital Partners operates under strict regulatory compliance. I have a legal fiduciary duty to my limited partners to protect their investments. If I discovered massive corporate fraud and tried to hide it to protect my sister and her husband, I would be legally complicit in your crimes. I would lose my firm, my licenses, and my entire reputation. And I am absolutely not going to burn down my empire to keep you warm." The color completely drained from his face as my words began to sink in. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I continued, my tone sharp and completely unforgiving. I said I did not just print a single copy of that forensic dossier to bring to a holiday dinner. The audit was finalized 48 hours ago. On Friday morning, my team of corporate attorneys submitted the fully unredacted financial report directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. We filed a formal whistleblower complaint detailing every single shell company, every fake purchase order, and every embezzled dollar. My mother let out a sharp, terrified cry. She finally understood the magnitude of the situation. She whispered the word federal, her voice trembling violently. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Brad. I said, "Yes, Brenda. Federal. The SEC already has the server logs. They already have the Wyoming incorporation documents." But we did not stop there. Because wire fraud and embezzlement are criminal offenses, my legal team also filed a comprehensive criminal referral with the White Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They have the American Express statements showing Jasmine buying luxury watches. They have the records showing you funneling millions of dollars through offshore accounts. I sat back in my chair, watching the last remaining shred of his arrogance evaporate into the warm air of the dining room. I said, "You are not going to be dealing with civil litigators, Brad. You are going to be dealing with federal prosecutors. You are going to be dealing with government subpoenas, asset freezes, and grand jury indictments. The federal agents are likely already drafting the warrants for your electronic devices and your bank accounts as we speak. So you can go ahead and call your aggressive corporate lawyers. You are going to need every single one of them to negotiate your plea deal, assuming you can even afford to pay their retainer once the government freezes all of your stolen assets." Brad stumbled backward, his legs hitting the overturned dining chair. He lost his balance completely and fell heavily onto the hardwood floor. He did not even try to get back up. He just sat there, his back pressed against the elegant wainscoting of the dining room wall, staring at me with a look of absolute unadulterated devastation. The hammer had not just fallen, it had completely obliterated his entire existence. Jasmine stopped crying. The shock of the word federal had completely paralyzed her. She looked at her husband sitting on the floor, and then she looked at me. The reality of federal prison, of losing the house, the cars, the jewelry, and her entire elite status had finally crashed over her. I looked at the two of them, the perfect golden tech couple that my parents had worshipped all evening. They were completely destroyed entirely by their own arrogance and greed. The trap had closed, the locks were secured, and the keys were already sitting on a desk at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I let the absolute reality of federal prison settle over the dining room for a long, heavy moment. I watched Brad sitting on the hardwood floor, his back pressed against the wall, his breathing shallow and rapid. I watched Jasmine crying into the fine linen tablecloth, her tears ruining the perfect holiday setting my mother had spent all week preparing. The criminal justice system was going to completely destroy their freedom, but the federal government operates on its own timeline. Building a rock-solid indictment takes months of grand jury testimonies and evidence processing. I had absolutely no intention of waiting for the federal authorities to physically remove them from my corporate payroll. I was the chief executive officer, and I had the power to enact immediate catastrophic consequences right here at the dinner table. I reached back into my leather tote bag one final time. I bypassed the thick manila folder containing the forensic audit and pulled out a single sleek black portfolio. I placed it gently onto the mahogany table directly in front of my own plate. The sound of the leather hitting the wood made Brad flinch instinctively. I kept my voice perfectly level, projecting a cold, sterile authority that belonged in a corporate boardroom, not a family dining room. I said the Securities and Exchange Commission will take their time building the criminal case against you. But Onyx Capital Partners operates with absolute immediate efficiency. While the two of you were out shopping for expensive holiday gifts with stolen company money on Friday afternoon, I called an emergency session of the Nova Stream Board of Directors. I presented the executive summary of the forensic audit to the entire board. I showed them the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the fraudulent sales numbers, and the itemized receipts for your luxury lifestyle. I looked down at Brad, who was staring up at me from the floor with hollow, defeated eyes. I said the board of directors did not need to deliberate. The vote was entirely unanimous, and the resolution was signed at exactly 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. I opened the black portfolio and took out 2 thick stacks of legal documents printed on heavy stock paper and bound with silver clips. I slid the first stack across the table. It stopped right at the edge of the wood, hovering directly above Brad and his head. I said, Brad, effective immediately, your employment as the vice president of sales at NovaStream is officially terminated. You are not being laid off. You are not being asked to resign to save face in the industry. You are being fired for cause. That specific legal distinction is incredibly important, and I want to make sure you understand exactly what it means for your immediate future. Fired for cause means you have fundamentally breached your employment contract through gross misconduct and active financial fraud. It means the company has absolutely no legal obligation to protect you. I paused, letting the silence amplify the weight of my words. I said you are not getting a single penny of severance pay. You are not getting any transition assistance. Your corporate health insurance benefits were officially canceled at midnight on Friday. The company is actively freezing your retirement accounts pending the federal investigation to recover the embezzled funds. You offered me an entry-level customer service job an hour ago because you thought I needed a safety net. Well, your safety net has just been completely incinerated. You are leaving this company with absolutely nothing but a massive legal defense bill. Brad closed his eyes, his head falling back against the dining room wall. He did not say a single word. He was completely broken. I turned my attention back to Jasmine. She had slowly lifted her head from the table, her face puffy and streaked with dark mascara. She looked at the second stack of legal documents resting inside the black portfolio. She knew exactly what they were, but the sheer shock of the situation had paralyzed her ability to process it. I slid the second stack of papers across the table until it rested right next to her untouched plate of candied yams. I said, Jasmine, effective immediately. Your employment as the chief operating officer is also terminated for cause. You signed off on the fraudulent expense reports. You utilized the corporate credit accounts for massive personal enrichment. You completely failed your fiduciary duty to the company and its investors. Your corporate email account was disabled this morning. Your access badges to the headquarters have been deactivated. I pointed a finger directly at the diamond watch on her wrist. I said you will be handing over the company laptop and the corporate phone before you leave this house tonight. And that brand new Tesla sitting in my parents' driveway right now does not belong to you. It belongs to the company fleet. I have already dispatched a private recovery team. They will be arriving at your personal residence at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to officially repossess the vehicle. I suggest you clean out your personal belongings tonight. Jasmine let out a quiet, pathetic whimper. The elite, luxurious lifestyle she had aggressively weaponized against me all evening was being systematically dismantled piece by piece, but I was still not finished. The most devastating financial blow was yet to come. I folded my hands together and rested them on top of the black portfolio. I looked at both of them, my voice dropping into a harsh, unforgiving tone. I said earlier tonight my mother demanded that I hand over 5% of the company equity to protect our family harmony. She thought you deserved a massive financial reward for your supposed brilliance. But let us talk about the equity you already thought you owned. Let us talk about the stock options you were counting on to make you multimillionaires when the company eventually went public. I tapped my index finger against the polished wood of the table. I said when you signed the Series A funding agreement with Onyx Capital, you completely failed to read the fine print in the executive compensation clause. You were too blinded by the massive influx of cash to realize that my legal team had inserted a very standard, highly aggressive clawback provision. A clawback provision legally dictates that if an executive is fired for cause related to financial fraud or embezzlement, the company has the absolute right to instantly revoke every single share of equity assigned to that individual. I watched the realization hit Jasmine like a physical blow to the chest. Her eyes widened, and she started shaking her head in a desperate, frantic motion. I said yes, Jasmine. Every single share. The board resolution signed on Friday did not just terminate your employment. It triggered the immediate execution of the clawback provision. Every single vested stock option you currently hold, and every single unvested option you were promised, has been completely canceled. Your shares have been returned to the company treasury at zero cost. You own absolutely nothing. You do not have a minority stake. You do not have a seat at the table. You have 0% of NovaStream. The massive corporate wealth you have been bragging about to our parents for the last 6 months was entirely wiped out with a single signature. The dining room was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The absolute totality of their destruction was staggering. They had walked into this Christmas dinner believing they were the absolute kings of the tech industry. They had mocked my clothes, my apartment, and my entire existence. They had tried to humiliate me, isolate me, and force me into submission. Now, less than 2 hours later, they were completely unemployed, entirely stripped of their wealth, facing massive federal criminal charges, and waiting for the repo man to take their cars. My father, Marcus, was staring at the legal documents sitting on the table. The patriarch, who had spent the entire evening demanding that I show respect to my betters, was completely silent. He had always worshipped money and power, and he was currently watching the greatest display of absolute financial power he had ever seen in his entire life. But the power did not belong to the golden child. It belonged to the daughter he had thrown away. My mother, Brenda, was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles completely white. She looked at the termination papers, she looked at Brad sitting on the floor, and she looked at Jasmine weeping uncontrollably. She opened her mouth desperately, trying to find a way to regain control of the room, to exert some form of maternal authority over the absolute chaos. She whispered my name, her voice trembling violently. She said, "Nia, please, you cannot do this. You are completely destroying them. They will have absolutely nothing left. They will lose their house. They will go to prison. You cannot do this to your own sister." I stood up slowly from my chair. I picked up my empty wine glass and set it down precisely in the center of the coaster. I looked down at my mother, my expression completely devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. I said I did not destroy them, Brenda. I simply turned on the lights. They destroyed themselves in the dark, and they bought the matches with my money. I am just the person handing them the bill. I buttoned my simple, unbranded cashmere sweater and picked up my leather tote bag from the floor. The execution was completely finished. The corporate assassin had delivered the final blow, and there was absolutely nothing left for me to do but walk away from the wreckage. As I turned to leave the dining room, the absolute reality of their destroyed future finally broke Jasmine completely. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail that sounded more animal than human. She scrambled out of her chair, her knees hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. She crawled toward the edge of the table, reaching out with trembling hands to grab the hem of my cashmere sweater. I stepped back smoothly, refusing to let her touch me. She stayed on her knees, her perfect blonde hair clinging to her wet, tear-streaked face. She looked up at me, begging with a pathetic desperation that completely erased her elite corporate identity. She said, "Nia, please, please do not walk out that door. We are sisters. We grew up together. We share the same blood. You cannot send your own sister to a federal prison. I will pay back every single penny of the embezzled money. I will sell the Rolex tomorrow morning. I will sell the car. Just please call your lawyers and tell them to drop the federal charges. We can figure this out as a family." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely zero sympathy. I told her that sisterhood was not a magical shield that she could equip only after she got caught committing massive corporate theft. Before Jasmine could formulate another pathetic excuse, Brad suddenly snapped. The terrifying silence he had maintained since falling to the floor violently evaporated. The sheer pressure of the impending federal indictment completely fractured his mind, and he immediately turned his rage onto the closest available target. He scrambled to his feet, his face red and contorted with absolute fury. He pointed a shaking finger directly at his wife, entirely ignoring me and my parents. He screamed at her, his voice cracking under the intense psychological strain. He said, "You are going to sell the Rolex. You are the absolute reason we are in this massive mess to begin with. You never stopped demanding more money. You needed the luxury European vacations to post on the internet. You needed the Michelin star dinners to show off to your shallow country club friends. You bled the company dry with your massive credit card bills, and you forced me to find a way to cover up the missing capital. You completely ruined my professional life, Jasmine." Jasmine stopped crying and stared at her husband in absolute shock. The perfect loving tech marriage had evaporated in less than 10 seconds. She scrambled to her feet, her own anger suddenly overriding her panic. She screamed right back at him, her voice echoing harshly through the house. She said, "Do not dare try to blame me for your massive failures. I did not set up 3 illegal shell companies in Wyoming. I did not forge federal wire transfers from our living room router. You committed federal wire fraud because you were a pathetic salesman who could not close a single legitimate enterprise deal to save your own life." They stood mere inches apart, screaming vicious insults at each other, their faces twisted in pure hatred. The sophisticated elite power couple was completely gone. In their place were 2 desperate criminals actively trying to destroy each other to save themselves. My father sat frozen at the head of the table, his mouth slightly open as he watched his favorite son-in-law ruthlessly attack his golden daughter. My mother covered her ears with her hands, softly crying as she witnessed the total collapse of the marriage she had spent years bragging about to her friends. The illusion of their elite, untouchable status was entirely dead, leaving nothing but the ugly, toxic truth laid bare in the middle of the dining room. My mother could no longer bear the sound of their vicious argument. Brenda dropped her hands from her ears and brought them both tightly to the center of her chest, clutching her pearl necklace as if trying to hold her own breaking reality together. She began to sob uncontrollably, her entire body shaking with the heavy force of her devastation. This was not a theatrical performance designed to manipulate me into compliance. This was the raw, unpolished grief of an arrogant woman watching her absolute masterpiece shatter into worthless dust. She realized that she would never again be able to brag about her elite tech executive daughter to her wealthy friends. She realized that the entire luxury lifestyle she had so desperately attached her own identity to was funded by federal crimes. She looked at me standing near the archway of the dining room, her tear-filled eyes begging for a magical reversal that she knew was never going to come. Beside her, my father remained entirely mute. Marcus had not spoken a single word since I dropped the forensic audit onto the table. He slowly turned his gaze away from the pathetic screaming couple thrashing on his hardwood floor and looked up at me. I was standing tall, my leather tote bag secured over my shoulder, looking back at him with absolute cold indifference. In that exact moment, I watched the painful realization wash over his aging face. He had spent his entire adult life worshipping the absolute wrong idols. He had bowed down to the flashy corporate titles, the leased luxury cars, and the empty promises of a fast-talking salesman. He had actively alienated and humiliated his oldest daughter, entirely failing to recognize that I was the only person in the room who actually possessed the sheer grit and financial power he so deeply respected. He had placed his ultimate bet on a pair of arrogant grifters, and he had completely lost everything that mattered. But there was one person at the table who was not crying, and who was certainly not mourning the death of that toxic illusion. I shifted my gaze to the far end of the long mahogany table. My Grandpa Langston was still sitting exactly where he had been all evening, perfectly calm amidst the absolute destruction. He did not intervene to stop Brad and Jasmine from viciously tearing each other apart. He did not reach out to comfort my hysterical mother or my paralyzed father. He simply sat there radiating the quiet, unshakable dignity of a man who had finally seen justice served inside his own family. When our eyes met across the chaotic dining room, his serious expression finally softened. He slowly reached out with a steady hand and picked up his crystal glass of vintage red wine. He did not say a single word. He did not need to. He just raised the dark red liquid into the air, offering me a slow, deliberate nod. It was a silent toast of profound approval. He was acknowledging my complete financial victory, my absolute ruthlessness, and the maturity it took to execute the trap flawlessly, without ever losing my temper. I offered him a small, genuine smile in return. He was the only family I had ever truly needed, and he knew it. I turned away from the dining table for the final time. I did not look back at my mother, who was still weeping silently into her hands, or at my father, who was staring blankly at the wall in total defeat. I certainly did not spare another glance for Brad and Jasmine, whose vicious, desperate screaming match was now echoing through the entire house. I simply walked into the grand foyer, my footsteps steady and deliberate against the polished hardwood floor. I reached into the coat closet, pulled out my heavy wool tailored overcoat, and slipped it smoothly over my cashmere sweater. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the crisp, cool Atlanta night air. The absolute chaos of the holiday dinner was instantly silenced the moment the door clicked firmly shut behind me. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the fresh winter air fill my lungs. The toxic, suffocating weight I had carried into that house was completely gone. Waiting for me at the end of the long, meticulously manicured driveway was a sleek, jet-black Maybach. My private driver stepped out immediately upon seeing me opening the heavy rear door with a respectful nod. I slid into the plush leather seat, sinking into the quiet, absolute luxury that I had built entirely on my own terms. The driver closed the door, sealing me inside a perfectly soundproof sanctuary. As the powerful engine purred to life and the car began to glide smoothly down the street, driving away from that wealthy suburb and the shattered illusions of my family, I looked directly into the camera lens. The soft ambient glow of the passing city lights illuminated my face. I am telling you this story because I know exactly what it feels like to be the designated outcast. I know what it is like to sit in silence while the people who are supposed to love and protect you try to shrink you down just to make themselves feel bigger. But blood does not give anyone the right to step on your hard work. It does not give them a free pass to disrespect your boundaries, and it certainly does not entitle them to the wealth you have built with your own two hands. Sometimes the ultimate revenge is not a screaming match in the middle of a dining room. It is not throwing plates or begging for an apology from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving one. Sometimes the ultimate revenge is a signature on a legal document. It is the absolute undeniable proof of your success executed with flawless precision. Have you ever had to use quiet power to teach arrogant family members a lesson? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic people to protect the empire you were quietly building in the dark? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more secrets from the ruthless corporate world. Stay sharp, move in silence, and never let anyone tell you that you cannot handle the pressure.